Hello, dear Kali Akuno. How are you? How are your family and comrades?
Good, we're good. Everybody so far has been able to stay healthy. For the most part, keep their sanity. So we're good. I mean, we've been working hard, but in the main, the immediate family, kids, partner,
Yeah.
we've been good and been very fortunate to be able to kind of successfully stay in place, have our own food, etc. So
Okay, great.
we're doing good.
Okay, great. Kali, you are co-founder and co-director of Corporation Jackson. I know you did a lot for African community, but I won't just mention you also is a co-founder of the School of Social Justice and Community Development. And what I understand, this public school serving the academic needs of low-income African-American and Latino communities. You're living in Jackson, Mississippi. Could you tell us about the situation of African-American as they represent 79.4% of the population of the city?
Yeah, so Jackson is first off, I would say physically a very beautiful place. It's kind of in the what we call the heartlands of Mississippi, central Mississippi. So we're not in the Delta. We're just a little bit south of the classic Mississippi Delta. So the land is a little bit more elevated than it is in the Mississippi Delta region. And this place used to be a Choctaw trading post, and the Choctaw, the indigenous peoples, who were the stewards of this land. And it was built to be kind of a crossroads that they would trade with each other and with other indigenous nations along the Pearl River. So I think that's just important to note so folks understand kind of where we are situated and some of the background of the city and what role it kind of plays, because it shapes still to this day, this kind of trade nature, it still kind of shapes to this day the lives of the vast majority of Black people, of African people here in Jackson. It's critical to understand when you're thinking about Jackson, to think about what role it now functions within the overall kind of U.S. economy. And so Jackson primarily is a trading city, right? It's not a manufacturing city. It's not a city which kind of concentrates on producing agriculture. What it does is process goods that are produced in the fields of Mississippi and or transported either down the Mississippi River or across some of the major highways and railroads that have been built up as infrastructure to move both goods, but primarily people in a number of different directions, primarily north and south is one of the links of what Jackson kind of connects to. From the south, we have New Orleans, which is directly 3 hours below us. And to the far north, going basically straight up, is Chicago. And, the way that the capitalists have built the infrastructure, we're one of the transport nodes between that north-south intersection. And then going east-west, we're a big kind of central transport hub between the city of Atlanta and the cities of Dallas and Fort Worth, which are kind of the two major anchors. Now, why do I break that down? Because the population here of Jackson, Black population of Jackson, is overwhelmingly working class. I mean, 90% working class. It is also a population that is witness to some extreme poverty in the U.S. context. Roughly, officially, 20% of the Black population is unemployed in the city of Jackson at any given time. This is even during the best of times. I would argue that the real unemployment rate is close to 50%. At any given day here in Jackson, you can knock on the door of my neighborhood and the Black working class neighborhoods throughout the city, and you'll find, what's what we call an able-bodied adult, who's at home during the daytime, and you just can see that as an indication of how deep the unemployment is, how permanent it is, and how structural it is. So these are some of the fundamental things that we confront here in Jackson, and it's one of the reasons why we built Cooperation Jackson and really tried to focus on both what were the different kind of things that we could do on our own to stimulate a certain level of economic production and employment, and then on the other hand, to utilize the skills that exist in the community to serve the community. Because one of the things in Jackson you'll find, and in several other southern cities, which is different than northern cities, you have still a hard degree, an extensive degree of what we call hard skills here in the community. So there are a ton of people here who know how to do electrical work, who know how to do plumbing, who know how to, build houses, do brick masonry. Those hard skills are here in abundance. And what you don't have, however, is kind of an economy that enables people to practice those skills. So you'll find master bricklayers. There's one that lives a couple of houses away from me who just can't find work, or if they can't find work here, and if they go looking for work, it's typically in one of the big cities, Houston, Dallas, Memphis. And so what we also have here as a result of, we have a dynamic here in the Black community where young people in particular, once they graduate from high school, and those that graduate from college that are fortunate enough to go to college and graduate from college, they don't really stay here that much, because of the conditions. And so it mirrors in some respects a lot of conditions you might find in the Caribbean or find on the African continent, where the young people, particularly the educated people, leave to go to the United States or Europe. Instead of here, they're leaving to go to the big cities in the United States. So that's something that we've been working on, kind of reversing, so we can keep some of that skill and talent here and reverse the brain drain and the skill drain that happens and has been happening in this community for quite some time.
Okay. Is the Mississippi state still under confinement?
No.
You were or not?
We were for a brief period of time. The governor was very reluctant to put the state under confinement. We have a super conservative government here, a Republican government Governor Tate Reeves, who comes out of the libertarian, kind of extreme right-wing section of the Republican Party here. And most of the state legislature also is from the same kind of wing of the Republican Party. They emerged from what was kind of loosely called the Tea Party during the Obama years. So they have some wild notions. Our governor was one of those who was touting that the economy was more important than human life, and that folks were just going to have to be prepared to sacrifice in order to save the economy and save the American way of life. Literally was the talking points that they used. So he only reluctantly did that for about 3 weeks, following Florida, because there was a very strategic, and it remains, and I think it's growing, a very strategic campaign amongst the right, really following Trump's lead to deny the severity of COVID-19, to downplay its impact, and just promote a bunch of myths, about how it can be treated, who it impacts. And one of the things you hear, which is a code for the racist language that they're using now, is that COVID-19 isn't killing regular people. That is literally the language that they're using.
What does it mean, regular people, in their mind?
Regular people means white people.
White people.
That's code for white. Regular people means white people. It's not killing white people. It's killing poor black people who are the quote unquote the essential workers. People who now the concentrations are in nursing homes.
Yeah.
In hospitals, the nurses and doctors at the hospitals, and then folks who are working in concentrated factories, particularly meat factories, the chicken, the beef, the pork factories, which is a major piece of concentrated work for a lot of so-called low skill, low wage workers, which are primarily Black, Latino here in the United States.
What is the current situation in hospital in Mississippi State? And is Trump's announcement that any coronavirus patient coming to the hospital be treated without spending a single dollar is effective, or it is just an announcement effect?
It's just an announcement.
Okay.
That's a total lie.
Okay.
Here in Mississippi, to bring it home, one of our fellow, comrades and cooperators, member of Cooperation Jackson, she believes she may have been exposed by her son and his girlfriend and their child. She did some babysitting of her grandson, and she thinks she may have been exposed. She's having some kind of cold-like symptoms, no fever or anything yet. And we found this out yesterday. And so we said, hey, you make sure you get tested. And then now we're going to everybody that she's been in contact with as a precaution, including myself, we're going to go get tested later during the week. So we started the process yesterday afternoon. Number one, she started it earlier. She can't get tested until tomorrow. Now this started on Saturday. So she can't get tested until tomorrow. Several others who called are saying they won't be able to get tested until later in the week. And this is at the free clinic. If you want to get tested faster, there's another clinic you can go, and you have to pay $200 to get tested.
Oh.
So it's not true that anybody can get tested whenever they want, or even whether they're symptomatic or not. That's not true here in Mississippi right now. The way things are being conducted here is on the basis of private, individual, personalized healthcare. And so you get the coverage, you'll get the treatment that you can afford. There is no universal standard of care that exists within the United States. And so if you're poor and you don't have insurance, and you go to get the free testing, it is available now, but in a limited degree in Mississippi, at a limited number of locations. And the point I was raising, that you have to wait days. And that's a critical thing, because you have to wait days to get a test, and then you have to wait days to get a result. In the meantime, as we know with COVID-19 and what we've heard and what we've experienced and seen with loved ones that we know, you can go from just having a flu to being incapacitated within 2 to 3 days. So you may be in the hospital before you find out that you are actually infected, if you use the kind of the public option that is available. So the audience should know that that's very ineffective. And what it does is, in many cases, people are sick and symptomatic and suffering at home while they're waiting for their results, instead of being able to go get early preventative treatment. And that is a major factor which is causing a lot of deaths now, because people are not being able to be treated just at the top if they go into a hospital. So now, just so folks know, the general way that the Republicans and Trump are treating COVID-19, they're opening up most of the states now. I think there's only 2 that are not doing some level of reopening. And in 25, which is half of the so-called states, the infection rate is still going up. Right, it's still going up. And one of the preconditions that the Center of Disease Control laid out for all of the states coming from the federal government, that you weren't supposed to open unless there were 2 weeks of cases going down, the trend going down. They have totally ignored that. And what we see in like Wisconsin, Texas, they opened up, and now within a week, and it's been 2 weeks in Texas, their cases are starting to go back. Where they kind of flatline, the cases are starting to go back up. So, there's somebody corrected me yesterday, comrade corrected me yesterday when I said, well, we need to get prepared for the second wave, because of the states opened too early. They repeated history. They repeated some of the mistakes of what happened with the swine flu of 1918 and 1919. And they said, well, don't say that. Let's be accurate, because the first wave isn't over. I said, you're correct. You're correct. The first wave isn't over. So we're in for some trouble here. Mississippi is one of those states where the number is still rising, and what Tate Reeves did here was he initially just gave these precautionary warnings in March. The schools and things like that shut down. So my kids have been out of school since March, which I think was one of the correct things that happened. So it was more kind of an advisory order on the main for everybody from the state. Then it went to a 3-week period where it did shut some things down because of, the trends going on. Then he opened back up, and within 3 or 4 days of opening back up, it skyrocketed again. So then he shut it down again for about a week. And then basically without anything changing, right, he opened it back up, following Trump. And now the cases are going up. The hospitals are being overwhelmed. That is the situation here in Mississippi.
Do you know the exact number of African American victims of coronavirus in Mississippi State?
In Mississippi State, the last I looked at that was Thursday. We have, I believe it was 3,000 Black people who have been infected with the virus.
And how many in total?
In total, I think it's 6,000.
Okay.
Now, this is important because Black folks only constitute, roughly 40% of the state's population.
Yeah.
But we make up the majority of the cases, right? It's not even. And the death count is even more stark, right? Roughly 80% of the deaths in Mississippi, which I think now we're well over 1,200. But it's going up every day. So it's whether you have to look every day where these statistics are. 80% of that 1,200, I think, who have passed in the state are Black.
Correct me. The population, the African American population, represent 79% of the population
of Jackson, Mississippi, of the city.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah. 40% of the state.
Okay, of the state. Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay. And I did not make this difference. Okay, thank you. How does the federal state and its service take into account the problem linked to the coronavirus, but also the other consequences of confinement, such as domestic violence, maternity, loss of employment with the consequences of the explosion of requests for unemployment allowance, the informal economy, security across, access to money, among others.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the federal government is playing with people's lives here. But people need to understand it's very ideologically driven. So as of now, there have been, I think, 44 million, since March, 44 million people have officially applied for unemployment. So we're already beyond both per percentage and the pace, the speed at which this has happened. We've already exceeded the things that happened during the Great Depression here in the United States. And the economy fundamentally has, the real economy fundamentally has tanked in many respects here in the United States. Now, even here, people should understand, if you go to a grocery store or a convenience store, you're still able to get most anything that you want. There are some things which are still in very much a short supply. And that's primarily sanitation products, alcohol-based products and things like Lysol, things of that nature. Things to treat cuts, like hydrogen peroxide. Those things are in very short supply and hard to come by. Masks and gloves are extremely short supply and hard to come by. And now there's like some shortages of meats because of what's going on in some of the meat plants. But on the whole, most everything else is still very much kind of in stock, or you can wait a day or two and it comes by. But the fact that some essential things in this country are missing is a direct result of their policy, not a direct result of the kind of the lack of a productive capacity in the United States. So one of the critical things to note here, as a result of some of the policies from the Korean War and a number of things that go back to even the Civil War, there are periods of kind of emergency that United States law and United States precedent gives either the president or Congress the authority to kind of requisition businesses and have them produce for need. It's called the most common one that people know of and it's been talked about is like the War Powers Act. So Trump could have used that at any point in time to get companies to reposition themselves to be able to make masks, to be able to make ventilators, to be able to make the other personal protective equipment that particularly the doctors and nurses and other frontline workers needed, because there was chronic shortages, particularly in the end of March and throughout April, and that still remains. But instead of doing that, following their kind of very distorted neoliberal orientation, they resisted, and this is on record, they resisted the strategic calls to use the War Powers Act to stimulate and direct that production, and instead left it to the free market, to the corporations, to determine how much that they would produce and how much that they would profit from it. Because see, the War Powers Act basically eliminates certain kind of pricing mechanisms. And the government sets a price and say, we're going to pay you to produce mass at this rate, or we're going to pay you to produce mass at this rate. So it limits the ability to profit, so that to ensure that what is needed is made and that it can be affordable, right? Mm-hmm. They eliminated that. So that was one of the things that they made a very strategic choice from the very beginning to make sure that the accumulation of capital was not broken in any form or fashion, and that it was given more priority in actually meeting the need of people. Mm-hmm. That has been Trump's federal response to this entire epidemic, right? If you look at it in the concrete policy, I mean, that granted, he's promoted a lot of weird things. This you know, chloroquine, which is which I've taken, you know, when I've traveled different places for malaria in my history, will do nothing absolutely for a virus. You know, the people should know malaria is a parasite, not a virus. Two totally different things. Totally different types of treatment. But he has a personal investment in that, in the production of that particular drug, which is one of the reasons why he's promoting it. But I'm saying that because, see, what think with him in particular, you have to kind of separate the distractions from what he's really doing. And there's all these distractions with the hydrochloroquine, and you know, what if can people drink bleach and all these other crazy things that he's said and done, but his real policies are very much directed at making sure the corporations in this time can get maximum profit, which is not able to meet the actual need of, you know, folks. And begin the profit motive part of it, make sure that there is not met, because they actually want a scarcity to drive the prices up. So that has been their response, you know, to this whole thing. And Trump has already said, you know, number one, he's already treating, he came out two weeks ago and said, you know, we won, right? And people are like, what did you win? What are you talking about? Why did you make the declaration? But, you know, as it turns out, that was just saying, like, we're not going to put this as a top priority. Our top priority now is getting the country back open, you know, whether it's safe or not. And he came out and explicitly said that the American people needed to be warriors, right? And you know, just deal with the consequences of going back to work. And if you get sick, you know, just kind of suck it up. Because what they've done, this is critical to note here, they are creating legislation. They did this with the first, you know, kind of stimulus bill. They are forcing people back to work and making it so that the corporations are not liable for anyone getting sick. So if you go to work and you get exposed and you get sick, that is completely on you. Your job will have no bearing and have to pay no expense for your health care. So if you get sick and die, that's on you, completely on you. They are not liable, right? They don't have to pay anything, you or your family, anything. They're setting that up so that people cannot sue their companies, or their family cannot sue the company that you work for in case of a wrongful death. And so this is an enshrined policy. And then the other piece that they're doing now is they gave out, you know, a paltry, a very small degree of what's called welfare here, right? They gave a little $1,200 stimulus check to a number of people. Didn't go to everybody in this society. People should note that. There are millions of people who did not get it and who could not get it. So it wasn't universal, right? It was conditional. They set up a dynamic where on the state level, you can get state unemployment and then a supplemental $600 employment, again, for some special conditions and special situations on top of that. That only existed in 3 months. It's over in June. They have already stated they are not going to renew it, right? Even though there's now, you know, over 40 million newly unemployed people in this country. They're not going to renew it. And now they're saying that if your job calls you to come back, right? If you are fortunate enough to be in one of those positions, quote unquote, you know, your job calls you back and you refuse to go back, they will cut off your welfare. So they're literally forcing people to go back to unsafe work environments and not offering them any protection, because that means you go back to work. Most companies in this country do not offer health care. People should know that, right? You have to buy it in the market, and you're being forced to go back. There's no health care provisions. You get sick, the company's not liable. You die. So their program really it should be understood the federal program and the Republican program is conditioned on destroying the what unions still remain in this country, and forcing new working conditions and new social relations. So in many respects, they are using this as a grand disaster capitalist experiment to reset the terms and conditions. That's what they're doing right now. That is the federal response. That is the Trump response.
Okay. Face the lack of solidarity coming from the state, are forms of non-state solidarity being put in place? For example, what does Cooperation Jackson put in place?
Yeah. Well, this has been one of the beautiful things that has emerged here in this country. Mutual aid, kind of networks have sprung up all over the country on their own, and people in their communities have just taken to caring for each other to the greatest extent possible. I mean, it's on a serious magnitude here in the United States, and that shows a tremendous amount, in my view, promise for the left in particular going forward, because it requires a high degree of self-organization to be able to carry those particular activities out. So there are literally, there's a couple of different databases that have emerged, but there are well over, I think, by last count I saw, something like 5,000, new mutual aid organizations that have sprung up. We know there's many more because a lot of folks are just doing things but not connecting or even broadcasting it. We run into pockets of that here in Jackson, where folks are just doing mutual aid with each other and solidarity with each other, just on a street or on a block. People going out, if they have extra equipment, looking out for the elderly on their block. I mean, this is going on to a high degree from what we're hearing in our organizing work throughout the United States. So despite all the things I just mentioned about what the right is doing, the people-to-people connection has gone up tremendously in the United States. And so that is a bright spot. It's not going to get all the news and media attention, as some of these other things that are going on. But I think it speaks to the level of organization that is happening. So that's a beautiful thing. I think the challenge we have in this next period, from kind of a left perspective, is to get all these mutual aid networks organized to be more permanent fixtures and not temporary fixtures. And then I think the other piece is linking them up with different worker organizations so that we can do not only distribution of kind of the surplus that exists, but getting to productive activities ourselves that will help us transform the economy.
What will be the consequences for African American of the fact that states have organized a production crisis in closing all the work, which has never been seen before? In fact, they put all the world on general strike, thus disturbing the right to strike of workers. What will be the consequences for African American?
Good question. I mean, they've been pretty devastating so far. The level of hunger that we're seeing in modern times in the United States is unprecedented. Here and elsewhere. I mean, I've seen pictures and different comrades I know who are working at food pantries or doing some of the mutual aid work that we talked about. They're reporting lines that go for hours, numbers that they've never seen at the food pantries ever. Running out of food and supplies, at every time they open up the pantries for any distribution. So that really speaks to the concrete need that really exists. And a lot of I would say the majority of the working class, black, white, or otherwise, in this country, has always ever been only 1 or 2 paychecks away from being destitute. And now you're talking about millions of people who've not had paychecks now for 2 months, and no relief in sight. There was a good study that just came out looking at from Real Evidence in Georgia, which was one of the first states to blindly reopen. And what's been found that even with this rush to reopen, that roughly, I think it was 60% of the jobs are not coming back. Businesses have not been able to regroup. And then there was another study, I think, that came out of MIT, which said that roughly we should anticipate that 40% of the jobs that have been lost are never coming back, period. So, the economy is being reshaped, reorganized as we speak. And what we already see is a profound distortion of the economy that benefits the larger players. So, like, one of the clear winners in the competition that is, the capitalist society and capitalist markets is like Amazon. Amazon is growing in the midst of this exponentially. I mean, it was already a behemoth, and I mean, it's just becoming a beast now. And it's one of the companies, or it's the type of company that, for instance, the Republicans are very openly now calling, and they've been calling for that for a while, but in a position to do it now is to kill the U.S. Postal Service and have all of that be privatized and taken over by a company like Amazon. And that's high on the agenda now because they've been offering relief to different companies, but they won't offer any to the post office, which has been suffering. Now, one of the reasons why I'm talking about the post office, so folks know, the post office is one of the largest employers of Black people in this country. So it's not just that it's a public piece; it also represents a particular set of workers, particular set of interests, Black interests that they are trying to crush and destroy. Should also be noted, the same is true with like a lot of your public sector workers and employees throughout this country. Now, most of your public sector unions and public sector employees are Black, particularly Black women, who have some of the strongest representation that they intend on utterly destroying and weakening. So this has to be mentioned in terms of understanding, what is going on in the Black community, not just with those who are currently unemployed, but those who are being threatened, actively threatened, who have jobs right now temporarily. So I mean, it in the short term, it doesn't look good. It really doesn't look good. On the federal level and on virtually every state level. And I think we are part of what I know some of our work is doing is trying at this stage right now. We've took an initiative to try to form a broad coalition that would work towards a general strike. To both kind of win some concessions on the immediate front of personal protection and guaranteed income, but further still to in the long term to reorganize society, in favor of workers, in favor of oppressed people, oppressed communities. So that's the name of this coalition is called the People's Strike, and we chose that term and that name, very intentionally and deliberately. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is first educate people about what we can do to improve our own condition. And that's where the mutual aid piece that we were talking about comes in. And what I was speaking about, you know, the challenge that I think we have is to connect all the different groups that are doing mutual aid to each other and start doing a set of productive activities together where we are not only taking care of the community's need, but shifting production from a profit-making model to a use exchange model, right? Producing for need and distributing on needs, and really kind of just laying a broad foundation for a new solidarity economy. And I think that's within grasp. But one of the things we're going to have to do is figure out how to organize, you know, these millions of newly unemployed people, and to connect them with the millions of people who were permanently unemployed before COVID-19. Because see, that's another problem here. Is how resources will be distributed and to whom, without a serious political fight, will be along lines of privilege, you know, along class and assets and things that people own or did own and have access to, and race. You know, these are the two factors that we know will shape the response in a negative way, right? In an unequal way, an unequitable way, if there's no major fight back. And so we have some major tasks ahead of us in this country. And one of the things that you know we are calling for is to try to get people to learn from our history. And one of the more successful things that was built in the 1930s were these unemployed councils that particularly the Communist Party had built in the 1930s, which were real powerful institutions and won some major concessions in this country. So we're starting to do the educational work to let people know, hey, this is something that happened in the past to be the similar situation. There's some critical aspects of that we need to look at and bring forward to the present, to organize ourselves, to be able to first take care of ourselves, but also, you know, to be able to secure the resources that are needed, you know, for folks to be able to live, survive, and thrive ultimately. But it's going to be a challenge because the right is growing in strength, is growing in its aggressiveness, and is really stepping up acts of violence in this country on a daily level. So, you know, there's a high degree of self-organization that's going to have to happen in Black communities, you know, and very quickly, you know, for us to, I think, to kind of weather this, because, you know, a lot of, if those reports are true, and like the 40% of the jobs that existed don't come back, you can best believe that those are going to be concentrated in areas where we are situated, where Black workers are situated. And we already see a high degree of automation starting to come into more workplaces, you know, where capital is using this opportunity, if you would, to replace cheap labor with machines, you know, to do some of the very things that we were out, which means more of us are going to be permanently unemployed if they have it their way. So the impacts could be very devastating.
Okay. What we learn from this pandemic is that the victims are essentially poor, precarious, living in difficult conditions with little access to healthcare, but also, and that some people seem to discover it, that is mainly affected racialized people, Blacks, Arab, Latinos, Native. What is your reaction face this denial of reality of million persons all around the world? And secondly, what is your analysis of the fact that state, but also the international community, many trade unions and organizations refuse to grasp the question of structural and systemic racism by intrinsically articulating those to race and class? To race and class, sorry.
Now we get to the real hard question. Just being blunt, I mean, I hear what I know. I'm gonna speak to what I know best, which is the United States.
Yeah.
The response of the trade unions has been utterly pathetic. I mean, utterly pathetic to this point. They should be leading the charge and leading the fight, in my view, to reorganize society, particularly here in the United States, because, you know, the Republicans have made it known, and this president, you know, Trump has made it known that he intends on destroying unions. And rather than looking at the conditions and analyzing, you know, your enemy, and they are enemies to the trade unions, open enemies to the trade unions, seeing how this moment can give them, you know, strength to basically wipe you out, you should be, you know, on the front lines. And they've been absent. They've really, you know, been absent. You know, one of the things that is taking place here, there have been over 200 wildcat strikes and work actions in the United States since March. You know, and we haven't seen this level of strike activity really since the 1970s here in this country. But it should be noted that overwhelmingly 90% of all of that action has come from folks who were not in trade unions, and if those who were in trade unions, they did so outside of the wishes of the trade union leadership. So they did it spontaneously, and you know, I think in many cases just had to take their action into their own hands to secure their lives, because most of the wildcats have been over, you know, the insufficient personal protective equipment, what we call PPE in the United States, and hazard pay. That hazard pay is not being offered, which goes back to the piece around the liability I was talking about, right? Where the companies bear no responsibility because the political leadership from the state is saying that you don't bear any responsibility and just keep doing what you're doing. And we'll back you up, you know, on not having to be liable for the deaths that occur, you know, at your, as a result of folks working at your business. They need to be in up front and take this over. Now, we, with the People Strike, we've been in continued dialogue to the greatest extent possible with the trade unions, because we haven't given up on them. I don't mean we can't afford to. You know, not in our position, because they are still the strongest, kind of very organized forces of labor in this country. And they have resources, they have assets, they have tools that can be very beneficial in this fight. And we know as this crisis deepens and drags on, ultimately they're going to be forced to make some different decisions. So, you know, my own personal orientation has been to continue, you know, when and where I can, keep open a dialogue, keep pressing, keep arguing that you need to be doing more, and encouraging them to come into the fold. And again, I think ultimately they will, but, you know, to this point, they've acted in the United States as institutions of kind of social conservatism, you know, and there's, even amongst them, there's been a rush, stated rush, at least amongst the leadership, and we have to distinguish the leadership from the rank and file, you know, because there's been I should note, there's been a good rank and file response, you know, particularly from what's called the labor left forces and organizations, you know, in this country, represented by a lot of different organizations and groups, you know, in different areas. So like here in the South, we have the Southern Workers Assembly, you know, on a national level, there's a alliance called Labor Notes. So they've been, I think, well in trying to push and agitate within, you know, the official trade union movement for them to take up some action. So we've been keeping it open, but trying to move the official leadership to put all of their political weight and resources into this fight is something that we're going to have to continue to do, because the fight is coming to them whether they like it or not. And you know, we need them to get on board, you know, with this fight and to see it as a kind of an opportunity instead of a challenge, and to look beyond just the immediate kind of needs of just securing things, but the more structural needs, because capital is learning from this. That's the thing that we've been saying. Mm-hmm. You know, while we've been learning, they are also learning, and they have the advantage in that, you know, they have the political advantage, they have the legal advantage, and are already using this to reorganize, you know, labor relations and working conditions, and we're going to have to fight against that if we have any inkling of trying to have a better society.
Yes, Kali, but I think you will agree with me. The people fighting against racism fight at a certain level, at the level of moral anti-racism position. But what we need now, and therefore they focus only on race. What we need now is to articulate race and class. It means we need to change this moral anti-racism in a political anti-racism. That's the difficulty where we are. The people refuse to take in charge race and class. Just race or class, but not race and class.
Yeah, yeah. And I agree. We have that in the United States. And I should have made it clear, like one of the places and why we want to focus on the trade unions, particularly certain trade unions. Let me make that clear. So let me go back, because I remember I noted that a lot of your public sector employees, right, are Black women who are in these unions. Mm-hmm. And they bring a race and class analysis by virtue of their lived experience, you know, to these struggles. And one of the reasons why we want to encourage them in the unions, which also have some of this dynamic to kind of step into the forefront, is to bring that level of analysis and practice to the struggle. And, you know, because one of the things that we've been having a challenge with in our organizing work is, you know, our comrades and friends who primarily focus on race have been having a hard time wanting to engage, you know, in some of the work around the People's Strike because of its particular combination of trying to deal with a combined, you know, what we call intersectional analysis around race, class, gender, and also nationality. Because see, that's a critical thing here, that so many workers, you know, essential work in the United States, like farm work, that's not done by folks who are technically citizens of this country. And so they have even less protections than you know, these are immigrants from Haiti, immigrants from, you know, the Caribbean and Central America and Mexico and other places throughout the world. They're being denied wages but forced to work, living in some of the most abject conditions, or in these, you know, new concentration camps, these detention centers, you know, just warehouse. And so we have to combine that motion. And we're really trying to struggle against folks just having a narrow, that it only has to be, you know, race, and it only has to be Black people. We cannot ally with other folks. That is something that we are trying to break. It's going to take some time, I think, for many forces to come to that understanding in reality. But, you know, one of the big problems that we have right now, I think, in our struggle is the backdrop of these elections that are coming up. So, you know, the presidential elections here are in November. Mm. And there's a perspective amongst many that, you know, rather than trying to do direct action and mutual aid and solidarity, you know, as a primary focus, we should be just focusing on getting Trump out of office. And it's hard to convince folks that you can do both. Mm. You know, and right now, in reality, you have to. And one of the things that I know we've been cautioning on our end, just like this Cooperation Jackson, is really trying to have a conversation with folks. What if there are no elections in November? You know, what if they make moves to cancel the elections in November? And we want to put that on folks' minds so they understand the strategic choices, that are available to the right to exercise based upon history, but also based upon many of the moves that we see the Trump regime and its backers actually moving to set up. They're doing everything they can already to limit voting access and to make it a perilous activity, like they did in Wisconsin, forcing folks to engage in a primary under conditions of a pandemic, rather than doing mail-in ballots or for that, since it was a primary, just putting it off for a couple of weeks. And Trump has made and has been making. It's not like he was doing this before COVID-19. Making an argumentation that he should be able to get 4 more years, and he should be able to run for like a third term. He's made statements in the past. Folks can go check it that, the U.S. Constitution was a problem. It was limitation. It was getting in the way. So, there's been a toying, I think, rhetorical toying around noting him and the forces that support him as being fascist. I think we need to look at that as a concrete reality based on what is building and some of the things that he's been explicitly doing to encourage, like the development of Brownshirt type forces, with his calls to liberate Virginia and liberate Michigan, and encouraging, folks to show up at these state capitals armed and prepared to engage in intimidation and violence. That coming directly from the president against other units of government. We've seen where that goes historically, and it's not in a good place. And so we got to really get ourselves prepared. And that goes to, a deeper analysis, what you were saying, why we have to get folks to take a race and class analysis and take it in a historical perspective so that we don't short circuit ourselves in terms of dealing with the unities and the solidarities that have to be created to fight back, and to create a new society. And so folks don't work in silos or in bubbles, because trying to draw on some of those the old lessons that unfortunately we have to harken back to from what happened in Europe, but particularly in Germany, in the 1930s and 40s, like that old saying, first they came for the communists, then they came for the gays and lesbians, then they came for the Jews, and then eventually they came for me. And by the time they came for me, there was nobody to be in solidarity with me. Like, we cannot afford to replicate that history. We need to learn that lesson and be in solidarity, with each other to the greatest extent possible.
A jogger was killed by 2 whites in Brunswick. It will take, it took more than 3 weeks for the 2 murderers be arrested.
Three murderers.
Huh?
3 murderers.
Three
murderers.
Okay, sorry.
So the guy, no, just the correction, because this is one of the things we've been arguing for. So the guy who took that video, he was just arrested earlier this week.
Okay, he was arrested. He was part of the, okay.
Because what he did, and what the evidence demonstrated, why they arrested him, and what people have been demanding that he be arrested as well, almost from the beginning. Because what he did is he blocked Aubrey from running. He got in his way to distort him so that the other truck can catch up with him. So he was one of the accomplices in this murder. We need to make that clear to the world, right? That it wasn't 2 murderers, it was 3. And he was one of them.
Okay, thank you for the precision. The reaction of some African Americans was to demand the right to take up arms to avenge the jogger. What does this reaction say about where the fight mobilization against racism is?
Well, I mean, folks should know that tendency has always been there, right? That kind of fight back tradition in the Black communities has always been there. very much rooted in the tradition of self-defense. You know, if folks want to read about that, there's a good book I would recommend by Professor Akinyele Amoja called "We Will Fight Back," and it's about how the tradition of self-defense was employed here in the state of Mississippi. You know, during the height of what's called the civil rights movement in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and how that complemented, you know, the kind of the nonviolent movement. So people can understand forces like the Deacons for Defense and Justice, which was an armed self-defense unit that existed before the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and in which the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense modeled itself on. You know, Black Panthers are more well-known historically, but you know, these are things that have existed, particularly in the South, basically since Reconstruction. So it's, I don't want the audience to think that this is a new type of response, right? It's something that continues to emerge at different points in time and kind of comes out of the shadows, you know, during these crises. But I think right now, the calls for self-defense, which are different than calls for, you know, kind of revenge. You know, some of what was being articulated there were calls for revenge, but the calls for self-defense are mounting and growing because of what we see, you know, with these charges on the state governments. So all this stuff is interlinked. You know, it's very much interlinked. And we got to remember, Aubrey was killed in February before a national crisis even hit. And then it took them 2 months with video to actually go and arrest those folks. And it wasn't until that video became kind of a national phenomenon, largely through the work of Black journalists, it should be noted, who kept us alive and kept writing it from the Griot and from the Root and some of these other institutions. Like, that's what really brought this home.
Yes, I understand the need of self-defense in the American way of life. It's quite normal. But the problem is, what does it mean about the fight, the mobilization against racism in terms of?
Well, I mean, what it means is everything here is more polarized now. You know, this is the United States has always been a polarized society. You know, particularly along lines of race. As long as I've been alive, it's been that, right? But this is the most acute that I've ever seen it in my, you know, short almost 50 years on this planet. Right now is the worst I've ever seen it. It was worse than it was under Reagan. It's worse than it was under, you know, that was pretty bad. It's worse than it was under, you know, Bush the first and the second. I think we are basically at a stage of kind of polarization that existed in the 1960s and early 1970s, you know, during the Nixon administration. We're at that level, and I think we're going to exceed that level very quickly and very rapidly because of the things that we are witnessing, you know, play out on a direct level. But we got to understand that this is part of a reemergence of the militancy we saw coming from the Black community after, particularly after Mike Brown's death. Yeah. You know, which gave birth to the movement for Black Lives. You know, that response. So that's went dormant for about 2 years, but there was a lot of organization that got built during that time, which is still going on. And that generation of particularly younger Black activists, that's who's at the heart of this response to the Arbery case. So they've gotten reanimated, and many of them are now, you know, moving from just thinking about mass protests to thinking about self-defense. And so you see in the maturation amongst them. That's what this call that you're talking about. Yeah, that is now what's objectively happening. That's what you're seeing, but they're getting that way because of the polarization, right? And it was hard, I think, you know, it was critical to know the movement for Black Lives emerged under President Obama, and it emerged under some conditions where people at least thought, I think it was wrong, but people at least thought that he would be able to contain the police, in a particular way, right? And he met certain demands, kind of cool to chill some things out, and then people got a rude awakening, from Donald Trump being elected, and he got elected on the basis of a white reaction to President Obama. We need to be very clear about that, right? Or a racist response. And I think that put that young movement kind of at a crisis of what do we do now? And they've been trying to figure it out. And I think these new conditions with these murders, the continued murders of Black, people, particularly youth, and these new conditions under COVID-19 and how that's playing out, I think it's sparking a new militancy. I think the challenge is to learn the lessons from the generations of the 60s and the 70s, and to start and to understand how the state will respond. And if it's going in a fascist direction, which I would argue it's been going in that direction, it's going to respond very quickly with a hammer, and then we will have to figure out, how to move under those conditions, which we haven't faced in many generation here, particularly in the Black community. So like I said, we got some challenges ahead, and some things we got to figure out.
In the white, liberal, and domineering capitalist system, Black bodies does not count. And we know that. Yeah. But a lot of people refuse to believe it. And specifically in Occidental countries.
Yeah.
Don't you think it is our responsibility to confront them with this evidence and how to go out about it? Because as long as the glass ceiling has not completely been broken for all Afro-descendants, our fight, our mobilization against structural and systemic racism could not stop.
I think in the United States, the conditions of COVID-19 have made this blatantly clear. I mean, even the mainstream media has had to acknowledge, the racial disparities in a consistent way. The liberals have had to acknowledge that this is primarily, killing Black and brown folks and indigenous folks. The reality has forced them to acknowledge something that they would rather deny, but it's just too stark. They can't deny it. Now, the question is, what does that mean? What does that really mean? To acknowledge it, but not have a program of dealing with it, or to not be willing to change the response in order to deal with it. Like, that's part of the political struggle. And that's the thing that I've been waging, so that folks don't just get satisfied with, well, they're talking about us and at least they're acknowledging us. Well, so they can do that and then change nothing. Change nothing about, how medical care is provided, who has access to it. And so far, they've done very little to change that. Like, so for instance, the clinic that I was talking about earlier that some of our folks are going to have to go to get tested. Some of our own members are going to have to go and get tested. It's like 6 miles away from our neighborhood. And we exist in a city that has virtually no public transportation. So the poor working class folks in my community, in effect, don't have access to that clinic. Because a lot of people in my neighborhood don't have cars. So if they get sick, most of them are going to wind up just being sick in their house and hoping that they don't die because they don't have health care. So it's, I think the liberal thing has been to acknowledge that, oh, there's a problem, there's an inequality. but it's still stuck in this piece of noting how unfortunate it is, rather than saying, well, we need to change how we move things, not just how we analyze things, how we provide and distribute resources. And that conversation is still yet to be had on a national level. And almost every time it comes up, it just comes up with like, well, we have to do better with the existing institutions, that exist, and they just need to be treated more fairly or distributed better. And it's like, no, it's the liberal institutions and that liberal view which allow racism to continue to persist. So it's more than just the act of recognition. Like, there has to be actual change, actual distribution of power and redistribution of resources. And that conversation is still not being had. And you see it playing out. I mean, I'm just going to use an example. You see it playing out in this country, in the go. Okay, you see it playing out in this country, and how the Democratic Party is going about carrying out its response to this crisis, particularly in relation to the contest around elections. So it's if nothing, we'll just focus on one issue. If nothing has been made clear from COVID-19, it's the need for a national universal health care system. Like, that has been made very clear. Bernie Sanders, the history has proven Bernie Sanders, who was kind of championing that cause, in that arena. There's been a demand for long before he came on the scene, but in that arena, he was championing that cause, and was kind of soundly defeated right before this crisis kind of emerged. But history has proven him right, as things unfortunately would have it. But yet, rather than the Democratic Party leadership and Biden, who's now supposedly carrying that torch, stepping up to the plate and making demands for that, right? They're just not talking about it at all, right? And why, to bring this back, why is this a critical issue around race? We got to remember it was the Black vote that saved Biden, right? He was almost completely wiped up until South Carolina, right? And then it's the other states. So Black people are responsible for him even continuing to be in the race. But the one of the communities that's being disproportionately hit by this crisis, by virtue of his policies, will not actually be if he wins, will not benefit.
How to draw the attention to all people willing or pretending to fight against structural and systemic racism to take into account race and class, as the structural racism is inseparable from capitalism?
I'm pausing because I think there was one set of answers before COVID-19. And I think there's some things to draw on from the lessons that we had before. But I also think that there's some new things that we got to factor in about how this is moving, how this is impacting everything. And it's organizing. I start with organizing questions, right? Which you alluded to like very early on. So how do we really organize under these conditions where we have to practice physical distancing, on a mass scale, and bring people together? And what makes that even more challenging is what we've seen here in the United States, and I'm sure it's not that much different in Europe, is that people say, okay, well, we can use social media. We don't control the social media.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? We don't control that. And to a certain extent, our use of it is actually giving more power, to the forces of capital, which are pushing big data and automation. And for us, why this become critical, several folks that have been working for us and several critical kind of left-wing voices in the United States, just within the last 48 hours, have been banned from Facebook and Twitter and given no explanation, right? No reason, like they said something wrong or they've violated some policy. And I don't mean like banned for a day or two. There's been 4 people I know who Facebook in particular just eliminated their accounts and would not let them start new accounts. So there's a level of monitoring where they tried to use, cloaking mechanisms so their IP address wouldn't be registered. They were able to follow that in 2 of those cases and block them. So how we organize under these means is a part of this challenge around how do we deal with the deep structural dimensions, because this is a new layer of the structural dimension. And it's one that we don't control, but which we've been made very dependent upon, at least in the so-called industrial, countries of the global north. And it's not a challenge that we should take, lightly. So, what we're trying to do, in our case, is to highlight a real program and the real need for decolonization and self-determination as a political principle in the response, in our organized response to this crisis. And to also call for and get people to be very clear about how this plays out in almost all facets of life. So one that I'll draw attention to is we've been asking folks to question, how does the food actually get on your table? Who is actually picking that? Who is actually doing the slaughtering? Because the crisis has made that more visible, like how things actually function and work, and who is doing, quote unquote, the essential work in this society. And so trying to highlight the in this country, we've been making an argument that the folks that you didn't want to pay $15 an hour to, and folks have been waging this campaign, that they weren't worthy because they were Black, brown, poor, that they weren't worthy for greater wages. Everybody's now dependent upon them in various forms of fashion, working at the grocery stores, working at the distribution plants. Everybody's now dependent upon them. And this highlights the whole question of, how is this society organized? We want you to really look at it, and why is this racial inequality at the bedrock of it, at the foundations of it, and what are we going to collectively do to change that?
Yeah, to change.
So, but the first thing that we're saying is that we have to get the left to recognize this.
It would be difficult. Really?
It is. But that's where we have to start, right? Yeah. In our case, that's where we have to start. So I say, look, we have some things in common, and you should have an understanding of this already, but it's weak at best. But the program that we are building makes that an anchor, and saying that this is where you have to start, and this is where our programmatic action has to start as a transformation.
But don't you think in the first step, it is better to mobilize and organize the African American or African descent and not try to work with the left, wherever it is, because we know exactly their position. They are not fighting for political anti-racism, but more or less for moral, compassional anti-racism.
We've always organized, the tradition I come from, we always organize in parallel lines, right? So folks understand that. First and foremost, we organize in our own community, Afro-descendant communities, Black community. Like that is our bedrock and foundation. And that will never change, particularly given our history here in the United States of the Black community being betrayed time and time again by the white left. We don't have any illusion that they might do so again should the opportunity present itself. Like if there's something the system can offer, that will say, well, you guys got to take a back seat, whatever. We know historically the white left will take that compromise again and again and again. Mm. So we're not in any way, myself and the folks I work with, we're not in any way blind to the history and blind to this tendency. And so, we organize the first parallel track that we have to organize our own people first and have our own base.
Yes, it is. Yes, I think it is the most important.
Yeah. And then we bring that along on, to anything that we do along lines of mutual respect.
Yeah, yeah.
And for any force that can't, accept that, we just don't work with them. We might be in some dialogue with them, but we just don't work with them. And that's how we carry some things forward. Mm-hmm. And I think in this case, the reality of it is, if you look at like who's doing the fighting back in the United States, I mean, really look at it. It's Black and brown workers who are doing that, Mireille. So any of these kind of white left forces that want to kind of get on board, they have to deal with the fact of who's leading the charge. And if they're not going to listen and be a part of, one of the things that I think has occurred is there's been a reassertion of Black consciousness, over the last 5 or 6 years, in part because of the growth of the movement for Black lives, right? It being a reemergence of the overall Black liberation struggle. And so one of the beautiful things, I think, it can be frustrating at times, getting some of our young folks to want to work with forces outside of their community. Like, that can be a problem in charge. But I don't fault them at all with saying, hey, we first got to start with ourselves, and we got to liberate ourselves. That organizing ethic, that principle, that political principle is very strong right now. And I think it's what's going to, if there's going to be anything that's going to save the day, it will be being able to build upon that foundation and reorient everything around us on that basis, right? And saying, if you can't abide by certain principles and norms, then you're going to be left by the wayside. And one of the things that we know here in the United States, it's always a challenge, is historically the greatest motion, what you would call the left, has always been driven by Black and Indigenous folks, and resistance by us.
But because the issue regarding what we said with the left, and even for us as African descent, the issue is to change the structure of the state, which is founded on domination and on epistemological lie, which one's only, it is only the Euro-centered modernity can direct the world. That's the difficulty for white left to understand.
Yeah, I mean, that's a deep obstacle here. I mean, as I imagine it is in France and other parts of Europe. In here, I think it may be, if I would dare say, probably somewhat worse than it is for France, because you have the deep dimension of the settler colonial dimension of whiteness here. Which is underscored by all these notions of, manifest destiny and like we always question. People talking about American democracy, and as Black folks like, what democracy? What are you talking about?
And what French democracy?
What are you talking about?
The state is still colonial.
Right.
In this context, do you think a reparation process could be part of the decolonial change as a rupture carried by Africans and Afro-descendants in order to change the paradigm of domination?
Absolutely. I mean, it has to be a front and central demand that we have to make, no question. And if even for those, you know, in our ranks who say, well, look, they'll never grant that. That's not the point of making a demand.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the point of making a demand is to clearly articulate that the colonial structures, the imperialist structures, have to be utterly eviscerated, and in all the resources that were extracted, you know, human and physical, like all of that has to be repaired and restored.
Mm-hmm.
And just the act of even trying to repair and restore it will deconstruct the colonial project.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And
So
the paradigm of domination. Yeah.
That's right. So we have to demand it. I don't think. I think for some of our folks who argue against it, that I think they missed the point.
Yeah.
That we're not trying to leave this in place and just, you know, have more resources, because that will still leave them in the ability to continue to extract from us.
Mm-hmm.
No, we have to deconstruct this whole project.
Absolutely.
You know, and reparations is a starting place towards that deconstruction.
And how do you think we can build an international decolonial movement for reparation, but for political reparation? How do you think we can do that?
Well, first and foremost, we have to build some organizations that are in constant dialogue with each other, right? And building an international program. We failed to do that. You know, I'm speaking both myself. We failed to do that.
Yeah,
we know it needs to get done, and we failed to do that. And there's reasons for that, but I think we have to make it more of a priority than we have, and set up the processes and the institutions that we need to be able to move that. And one of the things that we have to very intentionally build, I think, going forward to address that and make sure that there's organizational balance, and I'm saying this from about 10 years of seeing this particular struggle, is that there's some linguistic tools and resources that we have to nurture and develop. And we have to build and train and recruit some younger, you know, to be in the struggle longer, but, you know, because they have the energy. We got to build some ambassadors, right? Some real ambassadors to organize amongst us who know how to speak French, Spanish, Portuguese, English,
Wolof,
Yoruba.
Yoruba.
I think Hausa. What are some of the other critical languages? Swahili. Swahili. Xhosa and Zulu, right? And then I would say also Arabic, right? So
Arabic,
we need people to be able to, you know, navigate and link. And why this is so important, you know, because some of the things that have occurred here recently that I've been, you know, unfortunately very dissatisfied with, and because, you know, I'm not completely English monolingual, but, you know, to be able to carry a serious political dialogue for me, being a product of the U.S. colonial system, I'm not completely limited to English, but that's what I'm most comfortable with. You know, I'm not fully bilingual in any other language except, you know, or English, and that's a limitation because it's meant that I've had to get interpretations, particularly say from the Portuguese comrades or from Spanish-speaking comrades, from forces who are not in our movement, who don't understand our political language, who don't understand our tradition, right? And who miss the nuance of the things that are raised, who miss the cultural cues, or who have their own agendas, right? And leave out certain dimensions of what's communicated, right? And which have created blocks, which created, you know, issues in terms of representation or, you know, just challenges. And so the only way that I think we overcome that is developing those resources and skills ourselves, and in doing the level of training and development in our work, whether it be in France or the
Yeah.
UK or Spain or, the Netherlands, wherever, or here in the United States or in Canada or Brazil or Colombia or Venezuela, in all the different, countries on the continent and beyond now, right? Like we have to intentionally do that so that we are directly interpreting each other's experience to each other. And not have to go through so many mediating processes. So to me, that is a big priority of something I want to focus on in trying to play my role in passing the torch and bringing up some younger folks to be able to carry on this struggle.
Absolutely.
Like that's a critical thing. And it seems like to a degree, even here in the United States, somewhere, Mireille, it seems like this got lost in our tradition. Because as I go back and look at, some of the work our ancestors were doing, like before World War II. If you look at some of the things that the Council on African Affairs were doing, and then some of the work from Garvey to Du Bois, like even the folks that were coming from the United States then were able to speak French. And we're able to speak, Spanish, like those two in particular. And so you saw that Robeson had some of those skills, Du Bois had some of those skills, and if they didn't have them, they brought others who had that, and that's something we got to get back, and one of the things I've often felt it's been a big disadvantage of the age, I know, at least for me, and just how I learned, is I can't tell you how many countries I go to, and the meetings, when it's like an international meeting, and the meeting is in English. The meetings, and the meetings are all totally conducted in English. Whether we're in Brazil or, I was at, where was that? Someplace, somewhere in Asia, not too long ago. And I thought it funny that they didn't ask, would I need a translator? And that was one of the clear signs to me that, the meeting is going to be conducted in English. And so I got there and the meeting was all conducted in English. Now, mind you, there were only, by my count, from my understanding, there were only 5, including myself, only 5 English-speaking people, in the meeting of about 500 people. But anyway, it's just an example, I think, of this process of reparations, which we have to also start, by changing some of our behaviors of how we communicate, how we exchange, and get away from the kind of English-dominated world and system that we live in and its limitations.
Don't you think
because they've had an impact on building of the Pan-African movement?
Yeah, absolutely. And also it is a way to renovate, to regenerate the political Pan-Africanism, and not to stay with this romanticized Pan-Africanism. Don't you think it is almost the end? Don't you think we have to install such dialogue between Cooperation Jackson and the Frantz Fanon Foundation, for example, but others, about reparation, a political process on reparation?
Absolutely.
Okay.
A new start. We have to continue.
We have to continue, absolutely. How do you see, it is the last question, how do you see the day after the pandemic for Black people in the US and in all over the world?
The day after. Well, let me say this. We should be using this experience as preparation. and I don't say that lightly. Unfortunately, without major transformation of the global order, more of these pandemics are on the way, and we see that they've been developing at a more rapid pace the last 20 years. I don't think there's any way to deny that. And there's the aspects of the capitalist system and its productive processes, which now engender it, particularly, how we mass produce food, and produce diseases there that spread out, which is likely how this one started. But there's also a bigger crisis looming, and that's climate change.
Yeah.
And I think this we need to use this as a clear lesson and example. And I'm bringing that one up, not some abstract thing, but we have to recognize that the areas that are already being the hardest hit by climate change are areas where African people are concentrated. The continent is already, seeing some extended impacts of climate change. The Caribbean is also starting to see that. And here in the South, where the vast majority, the U.S. South, where the vast majority of Black people are, we're seeing the direct effects of climate change. Right here in my front yard, I've been witness to some profound changes the past 4 years of watching. May sound abstract, but it's very important to note, that the plants blooming, the insects coming out, and the birds laying their eggs and hatching to be able to feed on the bugs that come out to feed on the new plant growth. They haven't aligned in our area now for many years. Mm-hmm. And the cycle of life is breaking right before our very eyes. Mm-hmm. And this is going on all throughout the world. But we have to recognize the areas that are being most hit already are places where we are at, people of African descent are at. And we see that playing itself out in this mass migrations that are happening, particularly from Africa into Europe, and how that's being treated, in the most stark racist terms, possible, with all these new walls and military forces, not allowing people to embark that are coming over from Africa, trying to reach Europe for safety and security. So we got to take this serious. This is preparation time. Yeah. So I think my hope is that we get ourselves organized to a higher level, that we build some capacity to be able to meet greater threats and challenges after this. That's what I hope the first day.
Okay, thank you so much, Kali, for the time we had in conversation. And
thank you.
I hope it was good for you.
It was good. Good questions. These are some of the hardest questions people have asked.
Thank you. And I think we will follow the dialogue, discussion, and trying to build something on reparation, because I know also the Colombian, some friends, some comrades in Colombia are on the same page. And already we have some allies, and I think we can build a decolonial reparation movement, international reparation movement, crossed by Africanism and tradition.
Yeah, we will. We will.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
Take care too, and soon, Kali.
Soon.
Take care, and give my best regard to our comrades in Jackson, Mississippi.
Will do. Will do. Bye. Same.
Yes, absolutely. Bye.
Bye.